My name is Ethan Cole. I'm 48, born and raised in the Great Lakes, where winter drags on so long, you start wondering if spring is real or just a rumor designed to keep people from losing their minds. I like to joke that our winters last longer than the error list Brandon single-handedly generates in the system, and I'm not exactly the joking type. But honestly, if you've lived here as long as I have, you learn to find humor wherever you can. Otherwise, you'll freeze solid like the signal valves out by the yard. I've been a railroad signal engineer for nearly 30 years, longer if you count the apprentice years. My job isn't glamorous. It's not the kind of profession people brag about over Thanksgiving dinner, or the type that ends up in a news segment about inspiring Americans. It's the work of someone who knows one tiny mistake can cost hundreds of lives. I don't talk much, not because I'm arrogant, but because words don't fix technical faults, and wasting time is its own kind of risk. I'm meticulous to the point where Tom, my coworker, likes to joke that if I ever placed a screw half a millimeter off, I'd lose sleep for a week. I live alone near Lake Michigan. My house is old but solid, with thick walls that keep the wind out. From my living room window, the lake stretches out like a sheet of gray glass on days when the wind finally leaves it alone. After my divorce 7 years ago, I moved here, not to run from anything, just to find a place where I could hear the machinery inside my own head. At night, I tinker with old tools in my garage. The older the item, the calmer I feel. Some people call it strange. I call it meditation. My mind works best when I'm taking something apart and putting it back exactly the way it wants to be. Railroading in America is old, older than most people realize. And I'm part of one of the last generations that treats it like an extension of our own bodies. The railroad isn't shiny like in the movies. It's history stacked on top of bureaucracy stacked on top of a million rusted bolts and control panels. Only people like me still understand. Younger folks see software. Older folks like me see the failures, the narrow escapes, and the forgotten stories wedged between layers of steel. One of those older folks is Tom Walters. Tom is 70, close to retirement. He's the kind of person you always want in the control room. Talks even less than I do, but his eyes can tell you what's about to go wrong before it does. Tom hates unnecessary change because he knows that messing with something you don't fully understand invites disaster faster than a speeding train. He told me he felt something shifting in the company, something that didn't sit right. I just laughed because I'd felt it a year before he did. That shift had a name, Brandon Hale. Brandon walked into the company like he was the long-awaited gift to the entire railroad industry. Young, sharp suit, slicked, back hair, a smile so white it reflected the office lights. His LinkedIn headshot was polished enough to make people forget that real knowledge can't be edited with a filter. He came in as the Director of Innovation, a title that already told someone like me that trouble was on the way. People said he studied tech and modern management. I didn't doubt it, but if that was modern knowledge, then the railroad must have quietly returned to the Stone Age without telling me. I first met Brandon in a small meeting. I was looking over a signal map when he walked up behind me, arms crossed, nodding like he was inspecting fine art. Then he asked with the kind of excitement people usually reserve for their latest online gadget. "Hey, Ethan, can you reset an entire rail line the same way you reset an iPad?" I needed 2 full seconds to confirm he wasn't joking. Usually I'd nod or give a quick explanation, but that day I had to count to 3 so I wouldn't laugh out loud. I just said one sentence, soft enough not to insult anyone. "The railroad doesn't work like an iPad, Brandon." But the answer didn't satisfy him. Brandon raised an eyebrow, then told Tom that old technology was holding us back. Tom looked at me and I looked back. The kind of look where both people understand the problem is much bigger than a single stupid question. What made me laugh wasn't the question itself. It was the way he talked about the railroad like it was some food delivery app. I swear, if you handed him operational control of the entire network, he'd probably try swiping left and right to see if the trains would run faster. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That part comes later. Before I go on, what state are you watching from at the moment? Drop it below. I'm betting we've got a few folks from Michigan or Wisconsin in here. I started noticing the first signs of trouble about a week after Brandon stepped into his new role. It was a freezing morning, mist from the lake still clinging to the office windows, and I was checking the routine maintenance schedule when Brandon showed up behind me with the kind of excitement people have when they think they have reinvented the railroad for the second time. Hey, Ethan, our signal coordination software looks old. I want to refresh it. So I looked up at the screen, then at Brandon. The interface he was talking about was the main dispatch program, written nearly 2 decades ago by the old engineering team, most of whom had either retired or passed away. The interface was not pretty, but it was precise, stable, and safer than anything Brandon had ever touched. How do you want to refresh it, Brandon? He smiled. I want to get rid of these gray boxes. They look like ancient tech. We need something more modern, more optimized, less text, more color. I looked at the signal display chart. It had not malfunctioned once. Since 2009, the Great Lakes region has never had a major signal incident on the main line. I planned to explain gently, but Brandon was not the type who liked listening to explanations. I told him that this ugly interface once saved nearly 300 passengers during the 2011 blizzard. When the radar system got moisture and lost connection, it was this boring little safety module that sent a backup alert and forced the train to stop before entering a snowslide zone. When I finished, Brandon just shrugged, as if I were telling him about some antique car no longer fit for the modern world. We have to innovate. These gray colors put me to sleep. That sentence told me everything. The issue was not safety or function. Brandon wanted a legacy, something he could point to and say he changed. People like that exist in every company. They do not need to understand how something works. They just need it to look trendy. A day later, I got a notification that Brandon had created his first design upgrade. When I opened the file, I needed a few seconds to accept that I was seeing the right thing. It was a pastel-colored Excel sheet full of green, pink, and yellow cells smudged everywhere, like someone trying out paint colors for a nursery instead of coordinating a rail signal system. He explained that this was the new visualization. I asked why he made it in Excel. He said Excel was flexible, familiar to everyone, and easy to export to a PDF. I did not know whether to laugh or sigh, but I guess Tom had chosen to sigh. He stood behind me, arms crossed, looking at Brandon the way a father looks at a kid trying to blow into an electrical outlet. Brandon started deleting modules in the real system to make room for his new interface. Maybe he thought software worked like a kitchen shelf. If you want to change it, just pull it out. One of those modules was the backup safety module I had told him about, the one that saved lives. Brandon did not understand or did not care. He hit delete, confirmed it, and just like that, an essential part of the system vanished because it looked too gray. When I asked why he deleted it, Brandon said the new interface would have a modern integrated alert system. When I asked what modern meant, he pointed at the pastel pink Excel sheet and said, that Excel sheet disappeared too, but not because it malfunctioned, because Brandon forgot to save it. I remember that moment clearly. Brandon stared at the blank screen, confidence draining from his face. He clicked to open it, then clicked again. Nothing. Of course, there was nothing. If you rebuild an entire rail dispatch system inside a single Excel file and forget to save it, then the result is that the Excel file is gone. The rule is very simple. Brandon turned to us with a look that suggested the system had somehow eaten his work. This system is too old. It does not support changes. Tom stood behind me and shook his head. The kind of slow, quiet shake only people who have survived long enough in the industry can make, not despair. Confirmation. A quiet way of saying we were right. The real trouble had begun. I wanted to say something, but there was nothing soft enough not to bruise Brandon's ego, and nothing strong enough to make him understand. So I just looked at Tom, and Tom looked back at me, and like always, we were thinking the exact same thing. This was only the beginning. Brandon did not take long to realize that messing with the system and painting everything bright colors was not enough to prove his worth. People like him always need one more thing to complete the performance: a scapegoat. And in this company, no one fit better than me, the quiet one, the one who did not talk much, the one easiest to turn into a shadow to absorb every stupid decision leadership did not understand. Only 3 days after the disappearing Excel disaster, I received an email summoning me to a meeting with the chief executive officer. I was not surprised. What caught my attention was the note attached to it, an evaluation of cooperation between the legacy engineering team and the innovation team. I only needed one sentence to know Brandon had already moved ahead of me by at least a step. When I stepped into the meeting room, Brandon was already there, sitting to the left of the chief executive officer, with a face so serious you would think he had just finished negotiating a national rail expansion contract. On the screen was the title slide, glowing in neon blue letters, Railway 4.0. Underneath were keywords shiny enough to make me squint. Agile train flow, modern safety synergies, smart mobility shift. I sat down and opened my notebook. Tom sat beside me, eyes fixed on the screen, though I knew he did not understand a single word on it, because no one did. Those phrases were tossed together like a salad made from whatever buzzwords the internet was serving that week. Brandon stood up and adjusted his pastel pink tie, the same shade that would have matched the Excel file he once tried to pass off as a user interface. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had never been seriously challenged in his life. First, I want to report the difficulties during the innovation rollout. A few individuals in the engineering team are not fully open to change, and that affects our digital transformation pace. The chief executive officer nodded as if each sentence Brandon said carried some undeniable truth. I did not react, not because I agreed, but because I knew this was only the opening move. Brandon clicked the remote. The next slide appeared, full of colors and three-dimensional charts. He pointed at a bright red table. This shows that the old system has a high error rate, slow reporting, unfriendly interface, almost no scalability. I have proposed many improvements, but Ethan keeps delaying and refusing to cooperate. I looked at the numbers on the screen. They were completely false, fabricated from a few trimmed lines in the log files. The issues Brandon pinned on the old system were the exact problems he created when he deleted the safety module and played with the interface. But Brandon delivered them like they were objective truths everyone already knew. Tom cleared his throat, ready to say something, but Brandon beat him to it. He lifted a hand to stop him. Tom, you are retiring. Let us handle this part. The room went silent. Tom said nothing more. I could see something like a quiet fire tightening behind his eyes. The fire of a man who had spent a lifetime in the industry, only to be treated like decoration by someone half his age. Brandon clicked another slide. This one had three headings dressed up in elegant wording. Legacy obstacles, standardization delays, internal resistance, internal resistance. I assumed that was Brandon's polite way of saying me. Brandon kept going with that smooth, steady tone. There were times I requested adjustments or interface updates, but Ethan said they were unnecessary. I understand he has long experience, but the old mindset is slowing us down. If we do not change, we will always fall behind other transport companies. There were at least two parts of what he said that were true. I had long experience, and I did not agree to removing the safety module. The rest, I was not sure Brandon fully understood, even while reading it off his own slide. The chief executive officer looked at me and asked in a tone purposely softened, Ethan, what is your view? I looked at the slides, at Brandon, then at Tom. I thought for a few seconds, but honestly, there was nothing I could say that would convince people who had already chosen sparkle over substance. The truth only irritates those who worship appearance, I answered simply. I have never refused cooperation. I only refuse changes without a technical basis that could create risk. Brandon smiled, that light, dismissive smile of someone convinced he had already won. Ethan worries too much. You have to be bold. This is the digital age. He talked as if deleting a safety module in a rail signal system were the same as changing a phone wallpaper. I looked at Brandon and spoke slowly enough that he would know I was not joking. In every age, safety is still safety, Brandon. The room shifted a little, only slightly, like a breeze brushing across Lake Michigan. I knew I was alone in a room full of people who believed innovation meant bright colors and animated charts. They only needed a pretty story to retell at next month's meeting, and Brandon had prepared exactly that. Tom lowered his gaze to his notebook. He did not say another word, but that small, quiet shake of his head, I saw it, just like before, except this time, it did not mean trouble was beginning. It meant trouble was spreading faster than anything we had ever seen. And I knew Brandon was not stopping. This was only the warm-up for the story he wanted to build, a story where I was cast as the perfect villain. I have sat through more meetings than I can count in my 30 years in this line of work, but none of them felt anything like that morning. They called it an all-hands meeting, but the content resembled a pocket-sized tribunal, the kind where the verdict was written long before I walked through the door. The large meeting room on the third floor had glass walls overlooking the rail yard. More than 200 employees had filled every seat. I walked in feeling like I was moving against a current of people waiting to see who was about to be marched up the scaffold. The air was as tight as the lake surface right before it freezes. Everyone knew something big was happening, but no one said a word. I did not blame them. In this company, honesty caused more trouble than any blizzard. The chief executive officer stood at the front with his hands in his suit pockets, wearing the posture of a man who had long been accustomed to orchestrating the room. He was Brandon's father, a fact everyone knew but rarely mentioned, as if it were one of those open secrets no one dared to speak aloud in daylight. Brandon stood beside him with his hands placed neatly behind his back, chest puffed out like a schoolboy being honored in front of the class. I sat in the fourth row. Tom sat right next to me, sighing more than usual. When the chief executive officer began speaking, the room went silent. We are here to address an issue of obstruction to development. I stared at the stage. So they had brushed aside every explanation, every technical warning, every clear piece of evidence about who had been sabotaging the system. All of it reduced to one phrase: obstruction to development. The chief executive officer continued in a steady voice, the kind of voice practiced in front of a mirror all night to appear authoritative. During the rollout of the innovation program, certain individuals have not cooperated with the innovation team under Brandon's leadership. This affects both our progress and our team morale. The moment he said the word morale, I knew the next sentence would have nothing to do with engineering anymore. And I was right. We also received concerns from Brandon's wife. She said Ethan's behavior hurt her husband's morale. I almost turned to Tom to see his reaction, but I kept my eyes forward. Partly because I did not want to look like I was searching for an ally. Partly because if I looked at Tom, I might laugh. I had spent my life fixing signal systems, maintaining safety modules, rewriting ancient code, facing blizzards, breakdowns, and near collisions. And now, the reason I was standing in front of more than 200 people was that I had hurt Brandon's morale. I did not need to look down to know several people were exchanging glances. The kind of look people give when they wonder why they are being forced to witness such a performance. Brandon stood still, but the triumph on his face was impossible to hide. He did not speak, but he did not need to. His expression spoke for him. The chief executive officer went on, voice cold and even. Ethan, this cannot continue. You have years of service, and we recognize that. But if you hinder the spirit of innovation, you are hindering the entire company. I guess that line came straight from some pre-written speech crafted by the communications team. Lines like that always sounded impressive, while being as empty as a warehouse cleaned out in late winter. Then he delivered the sentence everyone had been waiting for. You are suspended until you apologize to Brandon's wife publicly in front of the entire company. The room froze. Some people looked down. Others looked up at the screen as if hoping someone would play a video revealing this was an April Fool's joke, even though it was December. Tom turned to me. His eyes did not show worry for me. They showed worry for the company he had given his entire life to. Worry because once absurd directives became acceptable, worse things always followed. I stood up. If you have never stood up in a room of 200 people waiting to see your reaction, I can tell you it feels like standing in front of a locomotive easing toward you. Everyone watches, not out of concern, but because they do not want to miss the spectacle. I stood straight, no smile, no irritation. And I said one word, understood, not because I agreed, but when a building is already leaning too far, you no longer try to brace it. You just walk out before it collapses. The room froze again. Brandon flinched slightly. Maybe he expected me to argue, apologize, or defend myself, but I did none of that. I accepted the information as if they had just told me snow might fall this weekend. I looked around the room. Some faces showed pity, some frustration, some fear. But they all shared one thing: silence. I was too familiar with the silence of the railroad. It was like the faint hiss before a train breaks, a warning of something about to happen. This silence felt the same. Not respect, a signal that something had bent so far it could not be straightened again. As I walked out, I heard a chair scrape lightly behind me, as if someone had begun to stand but changed their mind. Maybe it was Tom, maybe someone else. Whoever it was, they chose silence, and I did not blame them. I stepped outside and drew in a sharp breath of cold air, and I thought, with a thin layer of irony, everyone looked at me like I had just hit the power switch for the entire company. I did not know if I had at that moment, but I knew one thing for certain: someone had. They just did not realize it yet. I walked out of that meeting feeling like I had just stepped out of a theater where the play had ended long ago, but the audience still sat there, unsure whether to applaud or leave. No one said anything to me as I moved down the hallway. No encouragement, no handshake. No one asked if I was all right. Only the sound of my shoes on the floor and the wind slipping through the door frames, as if reminding me that winter in the Great Lakes did not soften just because a meeting had been absurd. I returned to my desk, the same desk I had sat at for years, long enough that even the drawer had memorized the way I opened and closed it. I looked around, just a few belongings: an old thermos mug, a railroad map, a notebook with worn edges. I packed everything into a cardboard box that the receptionist handed me. No one interrupted me. Maybe they thought I needed time, or maybe they wanted to avoid being associated with the man who had just been put on public display. I pulled open the bottom drawer. It made a small, familiar sound, one I had heard hundreds of times without ever noticing. I rarely opened that drawer. It held pieces of an old life I thought had drifted away forever. But today, when I opened it, I found myself staring at a fragment of the earlier version of me. A stack of paper files, edges yellowed with age, sat neatly in the corner. The 1996 contract. From when I was still an independent contractor, before the merger, before the expansion, long before Brandon arrived in this world as the self-proclaimed innovator. I lifted the file. The rough paper cover carried the smell of old documents mixed faintly with machine oil. I flipped through the pages, each one unfolding a part of the life I had left behind. Familiar technical clauses, signatures written in a hurry, and finally the page I always remembered writing but never thought I would need. Intellectual Property Clause, 14b3. I remember the day I wrote it. I was young then. I did not understand much about internal politics, but I understood technology risks. I had once watched an entire company collapse because of an intellectual property dispute, and I swore I would not repeat that mistake. The clause was written to protect my work if I were ever treated unfairly or removed from a project without a proper review process. I read each word slowly, as if I were reading a declaration I had sent to the future. If removed from the project without a valid review process, all modules developed by the engineer remain the property of the engineer. I stared at that line for a long time, not because I was surprised, but because I knew everything had just shifted. The company had never conducted a review process. They had simply called me in, made vague accusations, and demanded that I apologize to Brandon's wife to return to work. They had violated Clause 14. They did not know or did not care to know that inside the system they relied on every day there was a part that did not belong to them. It belonged to me. I set the file on the desk, plain and steady like a reminder. Not to seek revenge, not to prove anything. I was not the type to slam fists or demand compensation. I was too tired for anger. But I was clear-headed enough to understand my rights. Fair and lawful. If someone pushes you out of the house you built, you at least have the right to take the bricks you set with your own hands. I was not breaking any rule. I was simply activating a right that had belonged to me for nearly 30 years. I shut down my computer, pulled out my badge, and placed it gently on the desk. No slammed doors, no shouting, no accusations. Only the silence I had always known in this profession. And in the last moment before I stepped out of that office for the first time in many years, I looked back at the empty desk. Everything was packed. Only the old drawer lay slightly open, and the light from the window fell across the contract page. I whispered in my mind, calm enough to make the Michigan wind seem warm. If they want to fire the builder, they cannot keep the last brick. Then I closed the drawer and walked out of the office as lightly as if I were only taking out the trash, not starting an entirely new chapter of my life. Leaving the company, I thought I would get a few quiet days to sort out my life. Maybe brew a pot of coffee, turn on the radio for the weather report, and finish fixing the old drill that jammed the day before. But life has never operated on the schedule we expect, especially when you walk away from a system the entire company depends on, yet never truly understands. The backup safety module, the part that belonged to me under Clause 14B, began its license expiration exactly at 4 in the morning. That was the moment the system automatically checked for valid ownership. When it found none, it shut down quietly, like a light going off when you leave a room. No alarms, no sirens, no bright red warnings. It simply stopped. I wrote it that way when I was young because I knew loud systems cause confusion and panic. And because back then I never imagined the company would someday push me out without following a single proper process. Around 6 in the morning, as I was pouring coffee, my phone buzzed. Not from the company. I was suspended. It was from Tom, a short message, exactly his style. The system has issues. Brandon's dashboard is blank. Do you know anything? I sighed, not out of worry, out of recognition. This was inevitable. When the backbone of a system belongs to someone who has just walked away, the system reflects that reality. I did not reply immediately. I wanted to see how things unfolded. People like Brandon always move through 5 stages, just like the psychology books say. Denial, blame, panic, bargaining, and finally the realization that they were never in control. At the company, at 7:10 in the morning, the federal safety reporting system began failing. This was the report sent directly to the national regulators, the mandatory proof of daily operational safety. Without it, every train was running with one eye closed. At the same time, on the Northern Line, a late-night train almost passed a red signal because the backup module did not send its early warning. Fortunately, the engineer was an old hand, the kind who never trusted the system 100% and always kept a hand on the brake as a survival habit. If it had been a rookie that morning, the story would have turned out differently. Inside the office, Brandon began shouting. Those who heard said he looked like a kid discovering someone had taken apart his favorite toy train. He kept yelling at the engineering team, insisting the system had been sabotaged, that someone was intentionally corrupting the data. A few people tried explaining that the dashboard was blank because the original module was not responding. But Brandon did not understand, or did not want to. He slammed the keyboard. I imagined it was pure instinct, hoping brute force would somehow bring everything back. But the innocent keyboard only sank and popped back up. Comical, if not for the fact that an entire rail network was at risk. I received a second message from Tom. Brandon says, is your fault, asking if you shut off the module. I read it and smiled. Not out of satisfaction. It was simply predictable. When someone clings to power instead of competence, blaming others always comes before searching for the truth. By around 9, the company hired an outside engineering group, a young team, hair gelled, new laptops, contractor badges hanging neatly, looking every bit the part of professionals. They entered the system with the confidence of fresh graduates, walking into an emergency room convinced they could save the patient without reading the medical chart. But 20 minutes later, that confidence melted like early spring ice. They did not understand a single line of core code, did not understand the logic structure, did not understand how the modules communicated, did not understand why the functions were named the way they were, and certainly did not understand why the backup module was gone and could not be replaced. One of them told his manager the code looked like it was written by someone with a distinct personal style, the kind only the author could decipher, and if the author was no longer there, then sorry, they could not do anything. Tom sent me another message, longer this time. They are panicking. Dashboard is down, reports are failing, Brandon is losing control. The chief executive officer called an emergency meeting. They want to know if you can come back. What are you going to do? I looked at the screen, then set the phone down. I did not rush to respond. Everything was unfolding exactly as it naturally would, without any interference from me. I knew perfectly well what had happened. They thought I sabotaged the system, but I had not touched anything. Everything happening was simply the system executing a contract signed nearly 30 years ago. A contract they forgot to read. A clause they pretended did not exist. I took a sip of coffee and looked out the window. Snow was starting to fall lightly. I thought about the rail network now operating without its backup module. I thought about Brandon, running from room to room, shouting as if noise could replace knowledge. And I thought about the story that was only beginning. They had no idea that this was just the start. I was not at the company during that chaotic morning, but everything that happened was later described to me in such detail that I felt as if I were sitting right inside the meeting room, watching through the fog glass of silence. Not my silence, but the silence of a machine beginning to realize it had cut off one of its own legs. Around 10 in the morning, the company's legal department was called into an emergency meeting with the executive team. According to Tom, they walked in looking alert, confused why they had been dragged into what should have been a technical briefing. But after only a few sentences about the blank dashboard, the missing module, and the failure to send mandatory reports, the company's lead attorney asked to review every contract connected to the original system. That was the moment the silence in the room grew heavier, like wet snow settling on an old roof. As they flipped through contracts from the 1990s, I guess most people in that room did not even know what they were looking for. Old contracts are often signed, filed away, and forgotten like analog equipment gathering dust in a warehouse. But Clause 14B was not analog equipment. When the attorney saw it, Tom said she stopped, narrowed her eyes, then read it again to be sure. No one spoke, only the soft rustle of paper as she flipped back one more time. The intellectual property clause had never been voided, never replaced, never updated, meaning legally, the most critical module the system depended on still belonged to me. And when the company suspended me without a valid review process, they triggered their own loss of rights to use it. The chief executive officer went pale as she explained. Not pale from concern about me, but from concern for his own position if this ever became public. Brandon stood still, but seconds later, he turned toward the legal team. Ethan must have done something to the system. It could not just collapse like that. He sabotaged it after being suspended. People in the room did not react immediately. Maybe they wanted to believe it. Believing the fault belonged to someone already gone was far easier than believing it came from the person standing in front of them. But the attorney was not someone who let emotions lead. She asked for the system logs, and engineering provided them. Logs do not lie. They record history exactly as it happened, cold and precise. Tom told me that when the logs were projected onto the big screen, the entire room fell into a silence too heavy to describe. The kind of silence you hear only when snow covers the tracks, and the only sound left is the heartbeat of someone realizing they are about to make a very big mistake. The log showed the exact time the backup module was deleted, and the name attached to that action was Brandon Hale. Brandon's face drained of color. He tried to stand straight, but his voice cracked like someone unused to facing the truth. I did not know it was important. Who makes an important module look that outdated? Who still uses old code like that? That was when Tom, who rarely said anything harsh in his entire life, spoke. His voice was not loud or sharp. It moved through the room like a cold wind sliding across the lake on the first winter evening. That code saves lives, Brandon. There was no anger in Tom's voice, only disappointment. The kind of disappointment felt by someone who knows exactly how wide the gulf is between what looks good and what actually works. Brandon looked around the room as if searching for someone to take his side, but no one spoke. Some stared at the floor, some folded their arms, some looked straight at him with an expression I guess Brandon had never seen before. The look of people judging him by competence instead of title. The chief executive officer began mumbling something about needing more review, or how they could not blame everything on one person. But he must have known what everyone in that room had already seen. For the first time since Brandon joined the company, the shine around him had begun to crack. Brandon did not give up. He shifted his attack like someone swimming in freezing water, trying desperately to grab onto anything. If the module was so important, why did no one update it? Why let an outsider own it? This is a management failure, not my fault. The attorney responded in a level tone, the kind that feels like every word has just been stamped with a seal. That module does not belong to the company. It is the legal property of Ethan Cole under a contract still in full effect. The company only has usage rights while he remains an advisor in good standing and is not suspended without due process. Brandon opened his mouth, but no words came out. There was no space left for him to maneuver. Tom later told me it was the only time he had ever seen Brandon silent for that long. The meeting did not end with shouting or arguments. It ended in the heavy quiet of people realizing they had collapsed their own system. Brandon stared at the log screen as if it were a verdict he could not appeal, which in truth it was. I reread the last message Tom sent me that day. They know the truth now, and they cannot let this slide. Someone is going to call you. I set down my phone and asked myself the question I had known the answer to for a long time. It was not the system that failed, it was the truth finally speaking. I knew sooner or later they would reach out, but I did not expect the first call to come from the chief executive officer. Not the chief executive officer of the company I worked under. The chief executive officer of the entire corporation. In nearly 30 years, I had met him exactly 3 times, all of them at award ceremonies where I stood in the back row, avoiding the cameras. The call came at 8 in the evening. I was in my garage wiping down a drill bit when my phone buzzed. I looked at the screen and let out a long breath. If he was calling at this hour, it meant they had run out of options. His voice was polite, almost surprisingly so. I had heard him speak to subordinates with the tone of cold steel, but tonight he spoke to me like I was an honored guest stepping through his front door. Ethan, we need to talk. I set the drill bit down and wiped my hands on a towel. I did not answer right away. Years in this line of work had taught me that silence often carried more weight than words. Finally, I said, I am listening. The chief executive officer cleared his throat, as if choosing each word carefully to avoid brushing against the open wound the company was trying to hide. First, I want to clarify that what happened this morning was an unfortunate situation. We did not know the intellectual property clause was still active. I replied calmly, I believe that. But the clause is still legally binding, and the system only operates within the limits it was built for. A short silence. Then his voice returned, lower than before. Ethan, we need you to bring the system back online. It was the sentence they had spent the entire day avoiding. A simple truth. They needed me. Something they had never imagined would ever be the case. I stood and walked to the garage door, looking out at the lake swallowed by night mist. I did not sabotage anything, I said. I only kept what belonged to me, what the company agreed to give me in 1996. The chief executive officer rushed to reassure me. I fully understand, and I want to restore everything properly. But right now, you are the only person with the authority to reactivate the module. If the system is not operational by tomorrow morning, we will face a federal audit. I knew that. In the rail industry, a surprise federal audit is the last thing anyone wants. It is like inviting a health inspector into a restaurant kitchen during the dinner rush, I asked. And my contract, where does it stand? He answered immediately as if rehearsed. We want to sign a new vendor agreement. Ethan, you will no longer be an employee. You will be an independent service provider. Full ownership of your modules, and paid accordingly. I narrowed my eyes. Accordingly means what? The number he gave me kept me silent for a few seconds. Not because I was tempted, but because it was more than double my former salary. I knew they had no other choice. They could not run the system without its foundation. And that foundation was built one line of code at a time by me. But what drew my attention was not the money. It was the change in his tone. Polite, respectful, each word measured. Anyone overhearing the call would think he was speaking to a strategic partner, not someone suspended that very morning. After a moment, I said, send the contract to my email. I will review it. The chief executive officer exhaled in relief, like he had just avoided jumping into Lake Michigan in midwinter. Thank you, Ethan. Truly, thank you. I hung up, set the towel on its hook, and opened my computer. A few minutes later, the contract arrived. Every clause was clear. I was an independent vendor. I owned all modules. The company was licensing access on a monthly basis. No time limits. No technical interference without my approval. And most important of all, every technical decision involving my portion of the system fell under my authority alone. I signed it and sent it back. Not because I wanted to return, but because the system needed to be safe. A train has no business being put at risk because of a foolish meeting. The next morning at 5:45, I logged into the system with my new vendor credentials. I reactivated the module, checked the logs, and restarted each component. When the dashboard lit up again, I knew the rail network was safe. And I knew the company had learned a lesson it would never admit aloud. Meanwhile, in the office, Brandon was in a private meeting. Tom told me Brandon had been reassigned to the Department of Creative Strategy, a name impressive enough to fool anyone outside the company into thinking it mattered. But everyone inside knew the truth. It was an empty room with no projects, no system access, no team, and no connection to anything important. Brandon protested, asked why, asked who decided, asked if he could start over. But the executive team gave only one answer. For now, this is the most appropriate position. I did not know how long Brandon would stay there. Maybe a few weeks, maybe a few months. Maybe until someone decided it was time to change the sign on the door to make the title look new again. But there was one thing I knew for certain. The balance had shifted, not because I won, but because they finally understood the value of the things they thought were outdated, old, and no longer useful. They thought they could cast out the builder, but they forgot something. The builder always knows where the foundation lies. After everything had settled, I did not return to the company. Not out of anger, not out of pride, simply because I had lived long enough to know that some places rot from the inside, and no matter how many times you patch them, they will collapse one day. And I had no intention of standing under that roof when it fell. I opened a small office near Lake Michigan. Calling it an office was generous. It was a single-story wooden cabin with a window facing the water. I hung a cedar sign I carved myself, just a few simple words. Coal Rail Systems. The sign leaned slightly to one side because I did not measure properly. Tom would have laughed at me for a week if he saw it, but I liked it that way. It reminded me that life did not need to be perfectly aligned to run well. One afternoon, while I was reviewing operational logs from my new contract with the company, my phone chimed with an email. It was from Tom. Ethan, you did what I wish I had the courage to do 20 years ago. Just one sentence. But I read it 3 times. Tom was not someone who shared his heart easily. That line must have felt to him like admitting that sometimes silence is not strength, but the exhaustion of many long years. I replied simply, Tom, I only did what made the most sense. A few minutes later, he wrote back, sense is the hardest thing to choose sometimes. I set the phone down and wondered how many people in that company had thought what Tom thought, but never said it aloud. Probably more than I imagined. Every now and then I hear about Brandon, not from the company, but from social media. He posted on LinkedIn about an innovation mindset, about continuous improvement, about failure as a chance to grow. Nothing wrong with any of it. But under every post, the number of likes was a perfect round number. 0. It made me feel a little sad. The kind of sad you feel when you watch a cat try to jump onto a table and miss with all 4 paws. You do not hate it, you just do not know how to help. Tom said that at the company, people treated Brandon like a decoration. Nice to look at, but unable to carry anything. And more importantly, they no longer feared him. And the company itself, just as I predicted, they started doing what they should have done years ago, checking every old engineering contract. Tom said the legal office had days when the floor was covered with boxes of files. Everyone worried they might find another Ethan, or a third one, someone else with an intellectual property clause, just sitting quietly in a stack of yellowed pages. Clauses they once ignored because they assumed the people who wrote them would stay forever, or would stay obedient until the end. But that is the thinking of people who have never worked in rooms where one technical mistake can kill 100 people. We never write code for fun. Every clause, every process, every signature has a reason to exist. One late afternoon, I sat on my porch with a hot cup of coffee, watching a train move slowly along the tracks in the distance. The sky was a pale orange, reflecting off the lake, making everything feel so peaceful. I wished I could sit there forever. I no longer belonged to loud meetings, pastel spreadsheets, or presentations filled with empty buzzwords. I belonged to that moment, a moment where the sound of a train no longer tightened my chest but made me smile. I thought about many things. That meeting, Brandon, the chief executive officer, the faces that looked down out of fear. Some people said I should seek revenge, that I should sue, go to the press, make noise, but I disagreed. Sometimes all you need to do is to walk away from a house already falling apart, taking only what was yours, nothing more, nothing less. If they choose to understand the lesson, they will. If they do not, time will teach them. As for me, I have no duty to teach anyone anymore. My only responsibility now is to operate the part of the system I own with care and keep the trains running safely as they have for decades. The sky darkened. I leaned back in the wooden chair, listening to the wind sweeping across the lake. Peaceful. Enough to tell me I had chosen right. If you have followed my story this far, I want to say something. I believe there are many stories of quiet justice in this world. Justice that does not shout, does not threaten, does not need a stage. It arrives when everything is ripe, clear, and true. And if you like stories like that, subscribe to the channel. I promise to bring you more tales of ordinary people who were never weak. People who know when to say no, when to hold the line, and when to walk away. Whether you are listening from your porch, your living room, or the pickup truck parked outside, thank you for staying until the end. The road ahead is long, but today the trains are running safely, and so am I.